The woman stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882, carrying nothing but a single carpetbag, a worn leather satchel, and a pair of eyes so startlingly green they made the dust-caked world around her look like it had been painted in the wrong colors. The town of Caldwell sat on the edge of the Indian Territory border, a place where cattle drives arrived in thundering columns and departed as profit, where saloon doors never fully closed, and where a person's past was considered either a burden or a badge, depending on who was doing the asking. It was a cattle town through and through, loud and raw and unapologetic about both qualities, and it did not typically pause for anything as small as a single woman arriving alone. But Kate Winslow had a way of making even the most hurried men slow their step. She stood on the wooden boardwalk beside the stage office and looked at the town the way a person looks at a problem they intend to solve. She was 24 years old, with dark chestnut hair pinned up beneath a plain bonnet that had seen too many miles, a green cotton dress that was clean but undeniably humble, and those eyes. Those remarkable, clear, pale green eyes that seemed to take in everything without flinching at any of it. She had no reference letters. She had no formal introduction. She had the name of a man written on a folded piece of paper tucked into her satchel, a man who ran a ranch outside of town called the Hudson Creek Ranch, and she had heard through a mutual acquaintance back in Missouri that he was looking for a housekeeper. That acquaintance had passed along the information in the casual, half-interested way people share gossip rather than genuine assistance, and Kate had taken it as seriously as if it were a legal contract. She asked the first person she encountered, a heavy-set man loading feed sacks onto a wagon, how to find the Hudson Creek Ranch. He scratched the back of his neck and studied her the way men in cattle towns studied anything unfamiliar. That be Joseph Hudson's place, about 4 miles west past the creek crossing. You got business with him? I intend to, Kate said, and the certainty in her voice made the man nod slowly, as though she had just said something philosophically profound. There was no convenient way to travel the 4 miles. The stagecoach had moved on, and Kate had spent the last of her traveling money on the ticket from Independence, Missouri. She asked politely at the livery stable if there was any possibility of borrowing a horse, and the stable hand, a young man named Pete who was no more than 17 and entirely flustered by being spoken to directly by someone with green eyes, offered to hitch up a small wagon being returned to a farm along the western road. It would pass close enough to the Hudson Creek Ranch that she could walk the last half-mile. Kate thanked him with genuine warmth and climbed onto the wagon seat beside an elderly farmer named Elias Greer, who smelled of tobacco and creek water and seemed entirely unbothered by the company. He talked about the weather for most of the journey, which suited Kate perfectly because it meant she could watch the Kansas landscape roll by and prepare herself for what came next. What came next was harder to prepare for than she had anticipated. The Hudson Creek Ranch was not what she had imagined from the brief, vague description she had been given. She had expected something modest, a working ranch with a small house and perhaps a bunkhouse. What she found when she walked the last half-mile on her own, carpetbag in one hand and satchel in the other, was a proper spread. There were 2 large barns painted red, a substantial main house with a covered porch running along its full front length, a smokehouse, a chicken coop, a vegetable garden that someone had clearly put serious effort into, and a corral currently occupied by half a dozen horses of obvious quality. A man was working in that corral. She saw him before he saw her, which gave her a moment she would later think of as fortuitous. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of lean, work-built frame that came from years of actual labor rather than any deliberate cultivation of it. He was working with a young roan gelding, moving with a patience and quiet deliberateness that was noticeable even from a distance. He wore a faded blue shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, dark trousers tucked into boots that had been repaired more than once, and a hat that had probably been handsome when it was new. He was speaking to the horse in a low, even voice that Kate could not hear the words of but could hear the steadiness of. She stopped at the fence rail and waited. She did not call out. She had learned early in her life that interrupting a man, while he was working with a nervous animal, was an excellent way to start a relationship badly. Joseph Hudson was 28 years old, though the angles of his face and the steadiness of his dark brown eyes sometimes made people think he was older. He had come to Caldwell 6 years ago with his father, helped build the ranch from a single claim into something that now ran 400 head of cattle across leased grazing land, and had been running it alone for 2 years since his father passed from a fever that the doctor in town had not been able to manage. He had 2 full-time ranch hands, a cook who came in 3 days a week from town, and a persistent awareness that the house his father had built for a family was increasingly difficult to run with the casual arrangement he currently had. He had mentioned once, to a man he trusted at the feed store, that he was looking for a housekeeper, someone reliable, someone with experience and good character. He had expected letters of introduction, perhaps a recommendation from a minister or a previous employer. He had not expected a woman to simply appear at his fence line on a Tuesday morning in April. He noticed her when the roan's attention shifted in her direction. He followed the horse's gaze and saw her standing there, perfectly still, not speaking, her carpetbag set down at her feet and her hands resting on the top fence rail with a naturalness that suggested she was comfortable around working animals. He studied her for a moment before leading the roan to the far side of the corral and slipping out through the gate. He walked toward her directly, which was his way. He was not a man who approached things sideways. "Can I help you?" he asked. His voice was low and measured, not unkind, but not particularly warm either. The voice of a man who had learned to be careful with his warmth because he had a ranch to run and decisions to make and not always enough time for pleasantries. "My name is Kate Winslow," she said. "I heard through Thomas Aldridge in Independence that you are looking for a housekeeper. I am applying for the position." Joseph looked at her. He looked at the carpetbag at her feet, the single satchel across her shoulder, the plain dress that had traveled far, and the bonnet that had shielded her face through considerable weather. He looked at her hands on the fence rail, which were capable-looking hands, not soft. He looked at her face, and when he met her eyes, he held there a moment longer than he had intended to. There was something in them that was difficult to categorize. Not desperation, though she was clearly in a position where the stakes of this meeting were high. Not calculation, though she was clearly a woman who thought carefully. It was something closer to honesty in its most undecorated form, like looking at clear water and being able to see straight through to the bottom. "Do you have any references?" he asked. "Letters from previous employers?" "No," Kate said, without hesitation or apology. "I do not." He pulled his hat off and turned it in his hands, looking at her. "That makes things complicated." "I understand that," she said. "I can tell you what I know how to do. I can cook well enough to satisfy working men, which is a harder standard than it sounds. I know how to preserve food for winter, how to manage a household ledger, how to launder and mend. I know basic remedies for common ailments, which is useful when you are 4 miles from a doctor. I am not afraid of hard work, and I do not manufacture crises." She paused. "And I am honest, which I recognize you have no particular reason to believe, but I am telling you anyway." Joseph looked at her for a long moment. The morning sun was behind her, and it put a warmth into her chestnut hair that made the whole scene feel slightly more vivid than the ordinary world usually did. He was aware of this in the back of his mind, and simultaneously aware that it was not a practical consideration. "Why no references?" he asked. It was the question that mattered, and he was not a man to dance around the questions that mattered. Kate took a breath. She had prepared for this question. She had thought about how much to say, and had decided that honesty was the only approach worth taking. Partially because she was by nature honest, and partially because the kind of man who ran a spread like this would likely see through anything else. I was a housekeeper in Independence for a family named Calloway for 3 years, she said. The husband was a respectable man. The wife became ill and passed away in January of this year. After she passed, Mr. Calloway made clear that he expected the terms of my employment to change in ways I was not willing to accept. I left without giving notice, which means I left without a reference. I would not ask a man of that character to vouch for me, and I suspect you would not want him to. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable exactly. It was the silence of a man thinking through something real. The other families I worked for before the Calloways were in St. Louis, Kate continued. The Hendersons. I worked for them for 2 years, but that was 5 years ago, and people move, and the trail of letters required to verify something like that would take longer than I currently have. I'm being honest with you about where I stand because it seems like the only useful thing to do. Joseph put his hat back on. He looked past her at the road for a moment, and then back at her face. Your eyes tell me all I need, he said quietly, and then seemed to surprise himself slightly with the directness of it, because he looked down at the fence rail and then back up. I mean to say, you're either telling the truth or you're the best liar I've encountered in 28 years, and I don't believe you're the latter. Kate felt something shift in her chest, small but real, like a door that had been held shut by a strong wind being released just enough to move on its hinge. I am telling the truth, she said simply. I know, he said. He looked back at the house and then at her. Pay is $8 a month, room and board included. There's a small room off the kitchen that was used for storage. We'd need to clear it out. My cook, Mrs. Prentice, comes Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays from town, but she does not stay. You'd be here every day. My hands, Frank and Charlie, eat their meals in the bunkhouse mostly, but they come to the main house for Sunday dinner. He paused. I have 2 conditions. I expect honesty at all times, and I expect you to tell me directly if something is wrong rather than letting it fester into a problem. I do not have patience for things that could have been solved early and weren't. Those are conditions I can meet without difficulty, Kate said. He put out his hand and she shook it. His grip was firm and brief, the handshake of someone who took agreement seriously. Welcome to the Hudson Creek Ranch, Miss Winslow, he said. Let me show you where things are. The storage room was exactly as described, small and cluttered with things that needed to either find a better home or be discarded. Kate spent her first afternoon shifting wooden crates and old tools and a broken rocking chair that Joseph said had been his mother's, which Kate handled with particular care. She asked where to put it, and he said outside on the porch because he had been meaning to have the joint repaired for 2 years and had simply not gotten to it. She noted this without comment. By evening she had the room habitable, with a narrow iron-framed bed that had been in one of the spare rooms upstairs relocated to her space with Frank's help, a small washstand, and enough room to move between the furniture without difficulty. The window faced east, which meant morning light, which suited her. She cooked supper that first night from what was in the larder, a proper beef stew with biscuits and dried apple preserves she found in the cellar. And when Joseph came in from the evening barn work and sat down at the long kitchen table and tasted it, something in his expression shifted in the same small, real way that Kate's had shifted at the fence that morning. This is good, he said. The words were simple, but the way he said them was not, because he said them the way a man says something that has landed somewhere deeper than he expected. Thank you, Kate said, and went back to the stove. Frank and Charlie came in for supper as well, summoned by the smell, which Kate took as a reasonable indication that the food in the house had previously not warranted unexpected visits. Frank was about 40, quiet and weathered, with a beard going gray at the edges and eyes that were kind. Charlie was younger, perhaps 25, with a lively quality to him that made Kate think he would be easy to get along with and occasionally exhausting. Ma'am, Charlie said when they sat down, I don't mean any disrespect, but this is the best meal this kitchen has produced since the boss's father was alive. Joseph gave Charlie a look that was not quite a warning and not quite agreement, and Charlie seemed to read both possibilities simultaneously and focused on his stew. The first week settled into a rhythm that Kate found easier than she had anticipated and harder than she wanted to admit in specific ways she did not immediately examine. The easier parts were the work itself. She was genuinely good at it, at managing the house with efficiency and care, at keeping the larder stocked through careful attention and good relationships with the merchants in town, at cooking food that was both sustaining and good, at maintaining order without imposing rigidity. The harder parts were the particular awareness that came from living in close proximity to a man she was trying to understand and not think about too much. Joseph Hudson was not what she had expected, based on the single sentence of description she had received about him. She had expected a rancher. She found a rancher, yes, but one who read in the evenings by lamplight, who kept a shelf of books that had been read genuinely rather than displayed, who spoke to his horses with a kind of respect that was not performative, who was unfailingly fair with Frank and Charlie in ways that extended to including her in that same fairness without making any deliberate point of doing so. He treated her as an employee, which was correct and appropriate, but he treated her as an employee the way a genuinely decent man treats people who work for him, with consideration for her as a person rather than only as a function. He also had a quality that was harder to name. He was contained, not cold, but self-sufficient in his emotional life in the way that men who have had to hold things together alone often become. She got the sense that there was more in him than showed on the surface, and she found herself paying attention to the moments when something did show. The way he paused by the repaired rocking chair on the porch some evenings before going inside. The way he looked at the horizon sometimes in the late afternoon, with an expression that was not sadness but was adjacent to it. She repaired the rocking chair herself in the second week, quietly, borrowing the right tools from the barn and working on it in the late afternoon when she had finished her other tasks. When Joseph came in that evening and found it mended on the porch, he stopped and stood there for a moment. He ran his hand along the repaired joint. "You did this," he said. "I know how to use a chisel and dowels," Kate said from the doorway. "My father was a carpenter." He looked at the chair and then at her. The late light was doing something complicated to the air between them. "Thank you, Miss Winslow," he said, and his voice had a quality in it that made the simple words carry more weight than they might otherwise have. "It seemed a shame to let it stay broken," she said, and went inside to finish supper. The town of Caldwell had opinions about Kate Winslow. This was inevitable, because small towns in 1882 had opinions about everything, and particularly about women who arrived without conventional credentials or social context. Some of those opinions were generated by Mrs. Hartwell, the wife of the town's general store owner, who had a gift for distributing information about other people's lives with the efficiency of a Pony Express rider. She found it notable that a young woman of unknown background had installed herself at a bachelor rancher's property, and she found it notable in a way she felt compelled to share broadly. Kate became aware of this on her second trip into town for supplies, when she noticed the particular quality of attention paid to her at the general store, the kind of attention that means people have been talking. She handled it with the same steady equanimity she brought to most things, which was, she had found, both her greatest practical asset and occasionally her greatest social liability, because people who expected emotional reaction sometimes found composure unsettling. She purchased her supplies, exchanged polite conversation where it was offered genuinely, and returned to the ranch without giving the situation more weight than it deserved. She did, however, mention it to Joseph the following morning. His condition of directness seemed applicable here. "I think there is some conversation in town about the arrangement here," she said, while she was making breakfast and he was drinking his first coffee at the kitchen table, which was the time of day he was most reachable before the full demands of the ranch absorbed him entirely. He looked up from his coffee. "Is that surprising to you?" "No," she said. "But I want you to know I am aware of it, and I am not conducting myself in any way that should add to whatever concerns people have." "I know that," he said. "I also want you to know that if it becomes a difficulty for you, a reputational difficulty, I am willing to discuss arrangements that address that." He set his coffee cup down and looked at her directly. "Miss Winslow, I am a grown man running a legitimate operation, and I hired a housekeeper because I needed one. I don't manage my decisions around Mrs. Hartwell's dinner table conversation." He paused. "But I appreciate you mentioning it. That's the kind of thing I want to know about directly." Kate nodded and went back to the eggs. But something in the straightforwardness of his response settled into her the way warmth settles into cold hands, gradually and thoroughly. The spring moved forward in the particular way Kansas springs moved forward, with an expansive energy that turned the prairie green and brought the cattle trade back into full roar along the Kisham Trail, which passed through Caldwell on its way north. The town filled with Texas drovers and cattle brokers, and all the commerce and complication that accompanied them, and Joseph rode out to the grazing range most days from early morning until late afternoon, managing his own herd and the business of maintaining fences and water sources, and the 100 other tasks that running a cattle operation in 1882 required. Kate managed the house and began to manage it with an investment that surprised her. She had been a good housekeeper before, efficient and professional, but there was something about the Hudson Creek Ranch that called more out of her. Perhaps it was the quality of the house itself, which had been built by a man who cared about it and showed that care in small architectural details that were not strictly necessary, but made the space genuinely pleasant. Perhaps it was the obvious potential of the kitchen garden, which had been somewhat neglected, and which she began rehabilitating on days when the other work was finished. Perhaps it was simply that she had not had a stable place of any kind for several months, and something in her responded to stability the way a thirsty horse responds to water. She planted additional rows in the kitchen garden. She organized the cellar. She established a system for the larder that reduced waste. She mended things that needed mending throughout the house: a loose stair tread, a window that had been sticking in its frame, curtains in the front parlor that had come loose from their rings. She did these things not because they were assigned to her, but because she was there and they needed doing. Joseph noticed. He noticed in the quiet, observational way he noticed most things, without immediate comment but with an attention that she gradually became aware of. He would come in from a day's work and his eyes would move over whatever had changed: the mended curtains hanging straight, the new row of seedlings in the garden, the organized collection of preserved goods visible through the open cellar door. He said things, not elaborate things but genuine ones. "The stair hasn't creaked in a week," he said one evening in a tone of mild wonder. "The tread was loose," Kate said. "The nail had worked out. I used a screw instead." "Where'd you learn that?" "My father," she said. "I mentioned he was a carpenter." "You learned a great deal from your father," Joseph said. "He raised me alone after my mother passed when I was 8, Kate said. "He taught me what he knew, which was fortunate because what he knew was very practical." She had not intended this to be a personal revelation. It emerged with the ease of something that simply seemed relevant in the moment. She noticed Joseph receive it with the same care he gave most things, setting it down carefully inside himself rather than responding immediately. "My mother passed when I was 12, he said after a moment. "My father raised me. He was a good man." "I could tell," Kate said. He looked at her. "How?" She looked around the kitchen at the house. "He built this carefully. Men who build carefully for their families are usually good men." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that has content in it, that holds something between two people without requiring it to be named. The summer came down on Caldwell with its full weight, hot and wide and relentless. Cattle drives moved through in a constant rhythm, and the town was loud with commerce and occasional disorder. Twice in June, there were confrontations between drovers and local men over grazing rights and water access, the kind of disputes that were endemic to the cattle trade, and that sometimes resolved themselves through negotiation, and sometimes did not. Joseph stayed clear of those disputes where he could, and managed his own operation with a quiet competence that the men who worked for him clearly respected. Kate heard Frank say to Charlie one evening, not knowing she was within earshot, "Best boss I've worked for in 20 years. Fair as a plumb line and twice as straight." She filed this away with the other things she was filing away about Joseph Hudson, which was becoming a fairly substantial collection. There were evenings in July when the heat broke slightly after dark, and the porch became habitable, and she began to understand that Joseph sometimes sat in the repaired rocking chair in the evenings. Not always, not every night, but often enough that it was a pattern. She began to bring her mending to the porch on those evenings, because the light was still adequate until nearly 9 o'clock in July, and because she had found that some of her most useful conversations with him happened in that informal space, where neither of them was performing the roles of employer and employee quite so precisely. He asked her about Missouri. She told him about independence, about the river trade and the wagon outfitters and the particular quality of commerce in a town that was still, in 1882, a jumping-off point for westward travel, even though the great overland migrations had slowed. She asked him about Texas, where he had grown up before coming north with his father. He told her about San Antonio and the cattle culture of the hill country, about the particular kind of landscape that gets under your skin and stays there even when you have been gone from it for years. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "Texas." He rocked slowly in the chair. "Sometimes. I miss the landscape more than I miss the circumstances." The circumstances were not always good. He paused. "We left because we needed a fresh start. My father was clear about that. He did not elaborate and Kate did not push, but she noted it. She mentioned one evening, more to herself than to him, that she had not seen a night sky quite as large as the Kansas one since she was a child visiting her father's family in Nebraska. "Big sky out here," Joseph agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "You grew up in Missouri." "I was born in Nebraska," she said. "We moved to Missouri when I was 10. My father followed the work. Must have been hard moving like that." "It was normal," she said. "Normal and hard are not mutually exclusive." He looked at her with a quality in his expression that she was beginning to recognize, a specific quality of attention, focused and warm, that he gave to things he found genuinely interesting. "No," he said, "they are not." The summer also brought trouble of the ordinary Kansas variety. Specifically, a man named Dale Richter who ran cattle on the southern range, and who had a long-standing and apparently deeply felt opinion that the creek that gave the Hudson Creek Ranch its name actually crossed a boundary that was slightly more favorable to his property than the original survey suggested. He expressed this opinion first through a letter delivered by one of his hands, then through a second letter that was less politely worded, and then in person, arriving at the ranch one afternoon in late August with 2 of his men, and a grievance that had been fermenting into something uglier than its original form. Kate was in the kitchen garden when they rode up, and she stayed where she was, not because she was hiding, but because it was not her business and she had the sense to know it. Joseph came out of the barn and met them in the yard, and she could see from the garden that the conversation was tense. Dale Richter was a broad, red-faced man with a way of talking that involved a lot of forward lean and pointing. Joseph stood still with his arms at his sides and listened, which she had learned was what he did when he was managing something that required patience. Frank appeared quietly near the bunkhouse doorway. Charlie drifted out toward the corral, not aggressively but with a certain readiness. They were protective of the ranch, and of Joseph, in the way men are protective of something they have genuinely invested in. The conversation resolved without violence but not without tension, and when Richter and his men left, Joseph stood in the yard for a moment with his hands on his hips looking in the direction they had ridden and clearly working through something internally. Then he turned and walked toward the house, and Kate went back to her hoeing. He came into the kitchen 10 minutes later. She was washing her hands at the basin. "Richter again," he said. "I saw," she said. Is the boundary actually disputed? He sat down at the table. Not in law, I have the survey. He knows I have the survey. But knowing something and accepting something are different in Richter's mind. He rubbed the back of his neck. He's going to be a problem that doesn't go away on its own. Have you spoken to the county surveyor about getting a formal confirmation of the boundary? Kate asked. Something official that removes any reasonable argument he can make. Joseph looked at her. That's a good idea. It costs something, but probably less than whatever the alternative would cost, she said. He nodded slowly. I'll ride into Caldwell tomorrow and look into it. She set the clean flour sack she had been using as a towel down on the counter. Do you want supper early tonight? You look like you could use an hour of quiet before it gets dark. He looked at her with that particular quality of attention again. Yes, he said. I think I would appreciate that. She made supper early, and when she brought it to the table he ate, and she sat across from him with her own plate, as she had taken to doing in the evenings, because it had emerged naturally over the summer as the obvious arrangement. The hired man's eating schedule that she had initially intended to maintain had softened into something more ordinary and human without either of them formally deciding to let it. In September, Joseph received a letter from San Antonio. Kate could tell it affected him from the way he carried it in from the road unopened, and then sat at the kitchen table for several minutes before opening it, which was not his usual way with correspondence. She made herself busy at the stove and did not look. He was quiet through supper that night, and afterward he went to the porch, not rocking in the chair but sitting still in it, which was different. Kate brought him coffee without being asked and set it on the porch railing and started to go back inside. My father's older brother passed, Joseph said. He was the last of that generation in the family. Kate stopped. She turned around and leaned against the doorframe. I'm sorry. I didn't know him well, Joseph said, but he was there. He was part of what was. He looked at the dark prairie. There's something about when the last of that generation goes. It moves you up a step in some way you can't quite describe. It makes the loss more immediate, Kate said quietly, even when the relationship itself was distant, because what they represent, the whole layer of the past they carry with them, that goes too. He looked at her. In the lamplight from the kitchen window behind her, his face was angular and still, and the directness of his gaze had a quality that was almost physical. Yes, he said, that's exactly what it is. She stood there for a moment longer than she needed to, and then she said, I'll leave the coffee. Good night, Mr. Hudson. Good night, Miss Winslow, he said, and his voice was gentle in a way it had not been quite that way before. October arrived, and with it the change in the ranch's rhythm, the cattle trade winding down for the season, the days shortening, the prairie taking on the particular amber tones of autumn that made the sky look wider and bluer by contrast. The work became different rather than less. The seasonal preparations, the hay stores, the fencing repairs, the decisions about which animals to winter over and which to sell. Joseph worked long days of a different kind, planning and assessing rather than the purely physical work of summer. Kate baked heavily in October, filling the cellar with preserved goods, the smoked meats and pickled vegetables and fruit preserves and dried beans that would carry the household through winter. The kitchen was warm most days with the work of it, and Joseph would come in sometimes in the afternoons and stand near the stove with his coffee and watch her work, not intrusively, just in the way that a person gravitates toward warmth and occupied purposefulness. One afternoon she was pressing apple butter into jars, her hands stained from the work and her hair escaping its pins from the steam, and she looked up and found him looking at her with an expression she had not seen before. She met his gaze and held it for a moment, and he looked away first, which was unusual because he was not generally a man who looked away first. Apple butter, he said. 24 jars, she said. There were more apples on that tree by the fence than I expected. My father planted that tree, he said. It was small when he came here. He said it would take years to produce anything worth harvesting, and he was right, but he planted it anyway. Kate looked at the jars lined up on the counter, amber and warm in the afternoon light. "He was right, too," she said. "He was right about a lot of things," Joseph said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite sadness and not quite pride, but lived in the territory between them. It was in late October that Charlie, whose observational faculties were apparently more developed than they let on, said something in Kate's presence that he probably intended for Frank's ears alone, but that the kitchen walls were thin enough to deliver to her clearly. He said, "The boss looks at Miss Winslow the way a man looks at something he knows he needs and is not quite sure he's allowed to want." Frank's response was inaudible, but Charlie apparently received a rebuke, because there was a quality of chastened silence afterward. Kate stood very still on her side of the wall for a moment, and then continued setting plates for supper. She thought about what Charlie had said, not for the first time, because she had been thinking around the edges of a similar observation for weeks without quite arriving at it directly. She had been careful, very careful, about the nature of her own feelings, because she was an honest person, and honesty with oneself is sometimes the most demanding variety of it, and the honest answer to the question of how she felt about Joseph Hudson was becoming increasingly complicated. She had come here as a housekeeper. She was his employee. Those were facts, and they were important ones. He was a decent, principled man, and he had treated her with complete propriety. She had no reason to interpret anything he had said or done as an expression of personal feeling beyond the respect and appreciation due to good work, except that she was also an intelligent woman who paid attention, and the sum total of what she had observed over 5 months of daily proximity was a great deal more than respect for good work. She resolved to be careful. She was good at careful. November arrived with a cold front that pushed down from the north and reminded everyone in Caldwell that Kansas winter was not a polite suggestion. The days shortened sharply, and the porch evenings ended, replaced by evenings in the parlor, where the fireplace did its work competently. Kate read in the parlor sometimes in the evenings, or sewed, or worked on the household accounts that Joseph had trusted her to keep after discovering in September that she could manage figures accurately and without prompting. Joseph read as well, or went over his own ledgers, or sometimes simply sat with his boots off near the fire, and looked into the middle distance with the particular expression of a man conducting private negotiations with himself. They talked more in November than in any month before it, not because the evenings were necessarily longer, but because the close space of the fire-lit parlor created a different context for conversation than the open porch or the busy kitchen. The conversation ranged over various territories: books, which were a genuine shared interest, the history of the cattle trade, Kansas politics, which Kate found less interesting but Joseph followed with some investment, memories of their respective childhoods, and the gradual, careful, mutually acknowledged but not named territory of who they each were as people. He told her about a friendship he had formed with a young Comanche man named Esatapu when he was 13, living in Texas, the kind of friendship that was both genuine and profoundly complicated by the circumstances of the time and place. The Comanche had been pushed from their traditional lands through decades of pressure and violence, and the ranch country of Texas in the 1860s and 70s was a landscape of displacement, an injustice that Joseph had been old enough to see and young enough to not know how to hold. "Esatapu taught me to read tracking signs," he said. "His father had been killed by soldiers 3 years before we met. He never said anything about it directly, but I knew, and he knew I knew, and there was something honest in us acknowledging that the world we existed in was not fair and still choosing to be friends in it." Kate listened with the quality of attention she gave things that mattered. "Where is he now?" she asked. "I don't know," Joseph said. "We lost track after my father and I came north. I've thought about it." He looked at the fire. "There are things this country has done that it will not be easy to account for." "No," Kate agreed quietly, "it will not." She told him about a woman she had known in St. Louis named Clara, who had worked beside her in the Henderson household, a woman of remarkable intelligence and capability, whose opportunities were sharply constrained by the color of her skin in ways that Kate had been aware of and young enough to not know how to properly address. She deserved better than the world she was working in, Kate said. Better than any of us were able to give her. Most people deserve better than the world they're working in, Joseph said. Yes, Kate said. But some people are given substantially less to work with and are asked to survive on it anyway. He looked at her. You see things clearly. I try to, she said. It seems like the minimum we owe each other. There was a pause in which the fire popped and settled, and then Joseph said, without looking away from the fire, Miss Winslow, Kate. The use of her first name was new, and it landed between them with the quiet weight of something deliberate. He seemed to know it and paused a moment before continuing. I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that regardless of your answer, nothing about your position here changes. She set her sewing down. All right, she said. He looked at her then, directly, the way he always looked at things he was being serious about. I would like to call on you formally, properly. As a man calls on a woman he has feelings for. He paused. I have feelings for you. I have had them for some time, and I am aware that the situation has made it difficult to know what to do with them. But it seemed worse to leave it unsaid. Kate looked at him across the fire-lit parlor, at this man who was direct and careful and decent and increasingly necessary to her, in a way that she had been trying not to look at directly for 2 months. She felt something release in her chest, not dramatically, not with any theatrical flourish, but with the solid, real feeling of something that had been held under pressure finally being allowed to simply exist. I have feelings for you as well, she said. I have been trying to manage them with appropriate professionalism. Something happened to his face that she had not quite seen before, a specific softness that was not weakness but its opposite, the softness of someone allowing themselves to feel something fully rather than managing it at a distance. I would like you to manage them a little less professionally, he said. She almost laughed, and he almost laughed as well, and the almost laughter that they shared across the fire-lit parlor was somehow more intimate than either of them had expected. I would like that too, she said. He called on her formally. He did it the way a man of his time and character did it, which was to say, with complete seriousness about what it meant. He rode with her into Caldwell on a Saturday afternoon in late November, which was observed by Mrs. Hartwell and several others with the quality of attention usually reserved for significant civic events, and he walked with her along the main street and into the establishment that served meals at a table with clean linens, and they sat across from each other and had a conversation that was partly continuous with the conversations they had been having for months and partly an entirely new thing. Because the frame around it had changed, and both of them felt the frame. He was nervous, which surprised and touched her. He was not a nervous man by nature, but there was a quality of careful deliberateness in how he spoke and held himself that she recognized as a man taking something seriously enough to feel the weight of it. I should tell you, he said over the soup, that I am not a man who is easy to know. I have been told this. By whom? Kate asked. By women who found me reserved, he said, previous. My father used to say I had been built with too few doors. Kate looked at him across the table. You have let me through every door I've tried, she said. I think the issue is not the number of doors but the quality of the keys. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, that is a generous interpretation. It is an honest one, she said. I prefer honest. I know, he said and smiled. She had seen him smile before, but not quite like this, not with the whole of it, without any reservation held back. It changed his face completely, opened it, and she found herself thinking that she wanted to see it again as often as possible. They walked back along the main street afterward, and she was aware of the particular quality of his presence beside her, the physical fact of him, the way the afternoon light sat on his shoulders, the way he walked, unhurried and certain, the way he angled slightly toward her when he spoke. She was 24 years old and not inexperienced with the world, but she had not before felt quite this specific thing, the sense that the person beside her was exactly the right person to be beside, that the world looked more itself with them in it. At the livery stable, when he helped her up into the wagon for the drive home, he held her hand a moment longer than the practical requirement of the assistance, and the pressure of his hand around hers was warm and entirely purposeful. December arrived and wrapped the ranch in cold and the particular quiet of a Kansas prairie winter, snow on the ground and sky, and the smoke from the kitchen stovepipe rising straight up in the still air. The ranch contracted into itself the way ranches do in winter, the work becoming more internal, the days shorter and the evenings longer. Frank and Charlie were in the bunkhouse through most of the evenings, and Kate and Joseph had the main house to themselves in the evenings in a way that felt both natural and newly charged with everything they had acknowledged between them. He was different with her now, or she was different with him, or they were different with each other in a way that meant the relationship between them had a new quality of warmth and deliberateness that showed in small ways. He would put extra wood on the parlor fire in the evenings before she came in from the kitchen. She would make his coffee the way she had learned he preferred it, strong with no sugar, without being asked. They sat closer together in the parlor than they had in October, close enough that, when he reached across to turn the pages of the book he was reading, his arm brushed hers in a way that neither of them acknowledged and both of them noticed. He kissed her for the first time on a December evening, when the snow was coming down outside the parlor windows in the soft, continuous way that felt like the world was being tucked in, and the lamplight inside was warm and yellow, and she had said something that made him laugh, fully and real. And when the laugh faded and he looked at her, the small distance between them was so clearly the only thing separating what was from what he wanted that it seemed almost logical for it to close. He leaned forward and kissed her gently, briefly, with a tentativeness that was entirely inconsistent with his usual deliberateness, but that she found profoundly moving because it told her how much it mattered to him. She kissed him back, which was decisive enough that the tentativeness resolved itself. When they separated, the fire was still burning and the snow was still falling, and the world outside the window was exactly as it had been 30 seconds ago, except that both of them were in it differently. "I have wanted to do that for considerably longer than is reasonable," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "So have I." He took her hand and held it, and they sat like that in the fire-lit parlor with the snow coming down. And Kate thought about the Tuesday morning in April when she had stepped off a stagecoach with a carpetbag and no references, and the name of a stranger on a piece of paper. And she thought about all the improbable specificity of the path between that moment and this one. And she felt the particular deep-rootedness of arriving somewhere you did not know you were looking for. Christmas on the Hudson Creek Ranch that year was different from any Christmas Kate had experienced in her adult life, which had been modest and solitary for several years running. Joseph had no family nearby, and Frank and Charlie had no family to speak of at all, and the holiday had apparently been marked on previous years with a degree of dutiful practicality rather than any particular warmth. Kate changed this. She was not by nature an excessive woman, and the changes she made were not excessive, but they were genuine. She decorated the house with greenery cut from the cedar and pine that grew along the creek, arranged in the ways her father had taught her from his own mother's tradition. She baked through the week before Christmas with a kind of concentrated joy that she had not felt about Christmas since she was a child in Nebraska. She organized a proper Christmas dinner and included Frank and Charlie at the main house table, which caused Charlie to get a specific quality of sheen in his eyes that he covered poorly by talking more than usual. On Christmas morning, Joseph gave her a gift. He had clearly thought about it, which she knew because it was specific rather than general, a leather-bound journal with her initials tooled on the cover, done by the leatherworker in Caldwell, and inside the cover he had written, in his careful, sparse handwriting, "For the honest accounting of a life well lived." She held it for a long moment and did not trust herself to speak immediately. She gave him a muffler she had knitted in dark green wool, because she had noticed that he had no decent one and the winters here were cold enough to make that a practical deficit. He wound it around his neck with an expression of genuine pleasure and wore it for the rest of the day, which touched her considerably. They walked along the frozen creek bank that afternoon in the low winter sunlight, their breath making small clouds, the snow crunching under their boots, and he took her hand and held it through his coat pocket, which was warm and quiet and exactly right. He proposed in January. It was not theatrical, which suited both of them. They were sitting at the kitchen table going over the household accounts on a Sunday evening, which had become a shared task they both found more pleasant than accounts alone should reasonably be, and he looked up from the ledger and said, in the direct way he said things he had thought about carefully, "Kate, I want to marry you. I am asking because I believe we would be good together in the full sense of the word, and because I have been in love with you since October and have been managing the knowledge of it rather poorly." Kate set down her pencil. She looked at him across the accounts ledger and the lamp between them and thought about all the ways a person arrives at a moment, all the ordinary and extraordinary choices and circumstances, all the things that go wrong and all the things that go right, the stagecoach from Missouri and the carpetbag and the piece of paper with his name on it, and she said, "Yes, absolutely yes." He leaned across the table and kissed her, and the lamp flickered in the draught and then steadied, and the accounts remained unfinished for the evening. They were married in March of 1883. The ceremony was performed by the minister in Caldwell, a man named Reverend Alcott who took his work seriously, and conducted a service that was simple and sincere. Kate wore a dress she had made herself over the winter months, ivory cotton with small buttons down the front and lace at the collar that she had purchased from the dry goods store in Caldwell with deliberate care, and she carried a small bunch of dried lavender tied with a ribbon, because it was March in Kansas, and there were no fresh flowers yet. Joseph wore his best suit, which Frank had pressed with considerable effort, and he stood at the front of the little church with the stillness and gravity he brought to everything he considered important. And when Kate walked down the aisle on her own, because she had no father living to walk with her, he watched her the entire way with an expression of absolute certainty and complete happiness that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Frank and Charlie were there. Several of the merchants Kate had built relationships with in her months of managing the household accounts were there. Even Mrs. Hartwell was there, who had apparently reconciled herself to the situation and arrived with a casserole dish and an expression of modified approval. After the ceremony, Joseph took both of her hands in his and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment because nothing seemed necessary. The ride home to the ranch that afternoon was through the early signs of spring, the first suggestions of green returning to the prairie, and Kate sat beside her husband on the wagon seat in the March afternoon light and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, which was the absence of the specific weight that a person carries when they do not know where they belong. She belonged here, with him, on this land in this life. That knowledge was simple and solid and extraordinarily peaceful. The spring of their first married year was a full one. The cattle trade began to move again along the Kisham Trail, and the ranch filled with the seasonal work that required Joseph's full attention for long days at a stretch. Kate managed the household with the same investment she had brought to it as housekeeper, which was in fact greater now, because the house was hers in a way that made her care about it with a personal depth that went beyond professional competence. She expanded the kitchen garden substantially, with Joseph's encouragement, and added a small cutting garden along the south side of the house, because she had decided that a house of this quality deserved flowers visible from its windows. The boundary dispute with Dale Richter was resolved in April, when the county surveyor completed the formal assessment that Joseph had commissioned in the fall and delivered a document confirming the original boundary to the fraction of an inch. Richter received a copy through the appropriate legal channels and appeared to finally accept the matter, because no more letters arrived and his visits to the ranch ceased. Joseph filed the document in the tin box where he kept the ranch's most important papers, with a kind of quiet satisfaction that Kate found deeply enjoyable to witness. She was expecting their first child by early summer, which she told Joseph on an evening in May when the prairie was green and the light was long, and they were sitting on the porch together in the early warmth of the season. She had planned when and how to say it for a week, and in the end she simply said it directly, because direct was their way, and she watched his face go through something that was not quite describable in ordinary language, a sequence of realization and joy, and something that looked like the world rearranging itself around a new and permanent fact. He pulled her close and held her with his face in her hair and did not say anything for a long moment, and then he said very quietly, "Thank you." She laughed a little, pressed against him. "You had something to do with it. I mean," he said, "for all of it, for coming here, for being who you are." She held him back, her arms around him, the prairie wide and green around the house his father had built carefully, the apple tree by the fence coming into bloom, the kitchen garden already showing its early rose, and she thought that some moments do not need to be improved upon. The pregnancy progressed through the summer and into the fall with the ordinary mixture of difficulty and wonder. The summer heat was hard, and Kate managed it with her characteristic practicality, adjusting the household work to the cooler parts of the day and accepting, sometimes with more grace than other times, the limitations that came with it. Joseph was attentive without being suffocating, which was precisely the right calibration, and she appreciated it without feeling the need to say so every time, though she told him occasionally because she thought appreciation should be voiced. Frank and Charlie developed a protective quality toward Kate that was both touching and occasionally slightly excessive, particularly in Charlie's case. He once attempted to carry an armload of firewood she was perfectly capable of carrying herself, and received a look from her that caused him to revise his approach. He settled into a more reasonable version of helpfulness that involved being available without being presumptuous, which was a meaningful character development for a 25-year-old man. Joseph hired a third hand in August, a quiet, reliable man named Samuel Brewster, who had come up from Oklahoma Territory with solid references and a straightforward manner that Joseph liked immediately. The ranch was growing, the herd was larger, and the fencing and water management of a larger operation needed more hands. Samuel settled into the bunkhouse without drama and integrated into the rhythm of the place with a minimum of adjustment period, which told Kate something positive about his character. The child was born in late November of 1883, delivered with the assistance of the doctor from Caldwell who arrived just in time, and the supplementary help of Kate's own considerable stubbornness and physical determination. The labor was long and the night was cold, and Joseph spent a portion of it standing in the kitchen with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup he was not drinking, which Frank and Charlie observed from the bunkhouse with a sympathetic solidarity. It was a boy. They named him William, for Joseph's father. He was small and loud and entirely healthy, and when the doctor put him in Joseph's arms for the first time, Kate watched her husband's face in the lamplight and understood that she was watching a man understand something about himself that he had not understood before. "Hello, William," Joseph said, very quietly, and the child looked up at the sound of his voice with the unfocused but present attention of the very newly arrived. The winter of their first child's early months was the most domestic season Kate had yet experienced on the ranch, and she found it, to her own moderate surprise, entirely good. William was a demanding but vigorous baby, and the household arranged itself around his requirements with a naturalness that spoke well of everyone in it. Joseph was a father who took the role seriously in both its practical and its more tender dimensions, who woke without complaint in the night when Kate needed him to, who held William through the colicky evenings with the same steady patience he gave to nervous horses, who talked to his son in the same low, even, reassuring voice, and with very similar results. By the time spring came back to the Hudson Creek Ranch, William was beginning to look around at the world with a focused interest that made both his parents laugh and hold each other close. And Kate was beginning to understand that the life she had arrived at without a plan, following nothing but a name on a piece of paper and her own willingness to show up honestly, was a life that exceeded anything she might have planned if she had been given the option. She told Joseph this one April evening, 2 years after the April when she had first arrived, standing on the porch in the early warmth with William asleep inside, and the last of the day's light stretching long across the prairie. She told him simply and directly, the way she told him most things, that she had not known what she was looking for when she came here, but she was grateful beyond adequate expression that she had found it. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her since that first morning at the fence line, with the clear, open, direct attention that she had come to understand was his most complete expression of feeling, the equivalent in a man of limited external theatrics of something vast and sincere. "I knew the morning you arrived," he said. "Something in me knew. I didn't know what exactly because I had too much sense to put a label on it that quickly, but I knew you mattered. I could see it. From my eyes," she said, remembering. "From your eyes," he confirmed, and he smiled, the full smile she had first seen across a restaurant table in Caldwell on a November Saturday, the one that opened his face entirely and made her feel that the world was a fundamentally decent place. She leaned into him and he put his arm around her, and they stood on the porch of the house his father had built and looked at the prairie in the April light. And the apple tree by the fence was coming into bloom for the second spring she had been here to see it. And it was, as his father had known it would be, producing more abundantly than anyone had initially expected. The years that followed grew the Hudson Creek Ranch in every sense of the word. By 1885, the herd had expanded to nearly 600 head, and Joseph had taken on a fourth hand and established a solid reputation as a reliable seller at the Caldwell cattle market, a man whose animals were healthy and whose word was good, which in the cattle business were the two attributes that mattered most. He had the boundary document framed eventually, not ironically but genuinely, and hung it in the ranch office alongside the original land claim, because he believed in keeping visible the things that had been worth fighting for properly. Kate ran the household with the confidence of someone who has found her exact place in the world and settled into it without reservation. The kitchen garden grew to include fruit trees of her own planting, 2 pear and 1 cherry. Additions, she explained to Joseph, were an investment in the future in the same way his father's apple tree had been. He agreed without hesitation and helped her dig the holes. She established herself as someone the neighboring ranching wives called on for practical advice about preserving and cooking and the 100 small competencies that kept a household functional through the demands of frontier life. And she gave that advice with the generosity that comes from being genuinely in a position of abundance. The community of women around Caldwell was a varied and interesting one, and Kate found in it genuine friendships, particularly with a woman named Ruth Alderson, whose husband ran cattle on the northern range, and who had an intelligence and dry humor that Kate found refreshing. They visited when they could, which was not as often as they would have liked given the distances and the demands of their respective households, but they valued the time when they had it. In 1885, William was joined by a sister named Eleanor, called Ellie almost from the first, a baby of remarkable cheerfulness who seemed to approach the world as a fundamentally interesting place, and arrived at developmental milestones slightly ahead of schedule with a kind of casual confidence that made her parents exchange looks of amused wonder. William, at nearly 2, received his sister with a cautious curiosity that resolved within 2 weeks into a proprietary protectiveness that Joseph found deeply familiar in its shape. "That is you," Kate told him one evening, watching William carefully prevent Ellie from rolling too close to the edge of her blanket. "That is exactly you." Joseph watched his son with a look of recognition and love so pure that Kate had to look away briefly to manage her own response to it. "It's not the worst quality to have," he said. "No," she agreed, "it is not." Frank retired from ranch work in 1886, his back having finally presented the bill for 20 years of hard riding, and Joseph saw him comfortably situated with a small amount of money, and a reference letter written with such genuine warmth and specificity that it bore no resemblance to any reference letter Kate had ever heard of in its warmth and care. Frank went to live with his daughter's family in Wichita and sent a letter every few months that Joseph read aloud at the kitchen table, and that made everyone feel good about the world. Charlie stayed and grew into a version of himself that was considerably more settled than the 25-year-old who had marveled at Kate's cooking on her first evening. He was responsible and capable, and had, in 1885, married a woman from Caldwell named Agnes who was small and decisive, and absolutely his equal in every quality that mattered, and who visited the ranch with a frequency that Kate welcomed because she genuinely liked her. The summer of 1887 brought a drought that was hard on the whole region, the kind of sustained dry that turned the prairie brown and put pressure on water sources, and required every ranching family to make difficult decisions about their herds. Joseph managed it with the same steady practicality he brought to every challenge, making the decisions that needed to be made without drama and without panic, leaning on his knowledge of the land and the cattle and the resources he had built up over the years. There were weeks in August that were genuinely difficult, when the creek ran lower than Kate had ever seen it, and the sky was relentlessly, heartlessly blue. She sat with him on the porch on those evenings, when the heat of the day had finally released its grip, and the children were in bed, and the sky was enormous and full of stars, and she was simply present, which was sometimes the most valuable thing a person can be. She did not minimize the difficulty or offer false reassurance. She talked through the practical options with him when he wanted to talk through them, and she sat quietly when quiet was what the moment called for, and she held his hand in the dark on the nights when he lay awake working through calculations she could see in the tension of him even in the dark. "We'll manage it," she said one night in the third week of August, quietly, without exaggeration. "I know," he said, and she could tell he meant it, that the certainty was genuine rather than performed. "You've built something real here," she said. "Real things sustain." He turned his head to look at her in the dark. "So do real partnerships," he said. The drought broke in September with 3 days of rain that came in off the southwest in the particular generous way that Kansas rain sometimes came, thoroughly and without apology, and the creek rose and the prairie began its slow recovery, and Joseph stood in the rain on the porch for a few minutes without his hat and let it fall on him in the way a man allows himself to feel relief when he has been holding back from it. Kate watched him from inside the doorway and loved him with a completeness that she had long since stopped trying to quantify. The fall of 1887 and the winter that followed it were among the best seasons Kate remembered on the ranch. The recovery from the drought gave everything a quality of earned abundance that was particularly sweet. The stores in the cellar felt more valuable for having been carefully managed through the summer. The cattle that had come through the hard weeks were healthy and would be sold well, and the household settled into its winter rhythm with the ease of a well-made thing doing what it was made to do. William was 4, old enough to follow his father around the barn with a seriousness of purpose that Joseph found entirely delightful and accommodated with complete patience. He explained things to his son the way he did everything, clearly and without condescension, and William absorbed it with the focused attention of a child who has recognized that his father knows things worth knowing. Kate watched them together and thought about her own father, about what it means to be raised by someone who takes the time to teach you, and she was grateful in the particular way that goes all the way down. Ellie, at 2, was a force of personality that expressed itself with great vocal commitment and a fearlessness that occasionally required active intervention. She had her mother's green eyes and her father's determination, and the combination of those qualities in a 2-year-old was a full-time consideration. Kate managed it with affection and clear limits, and a sense of humor that Joseph said was the only reasonable response to a daughter of that much character. They talked in the winter evenings about the future of the ranch, as they often did, planning with the same easy collaboration that characterized most of their practical life together. Joseph had thoughts about extending the fencing to include an additional grazing section to the north. Kate had thoughts about whether a formal arrangement with one of the Caldwell merchants for supplying the household goods would be more economical than the current arrangement. They talked about William's education, which would soon require more formal provision than the reading and arithmetic Kate had been teaching him at the kitchen table. There was a school established in Caldwell that was within manageable distance for a child old enough to ride, and it was a reasonable plan, but that was still a year or two away. They also talked, one February evening with the fire high and the children asleep, about what Kate had wanted when she had left Missouri in the spring of 1882 and what she had found that she had not known to want. "What I wanted was simple," she said. "Work, a stable place, an honest arrangement. I had been in arrangements that were not honest and I was finished with them." "Is this what you imagined?" Joseph asked. She thought about it seriously because he deserved a serious answer. "No," she said finally. "I imagined competence and fairness and security. Those are not small things. I found them, but I found considerably more than that." He looked at her across the firelight. "What did you find?" She met his eyes, those dark, steady, honest eyes that she had been looking into for nearly 6 years and still found as clear and reliable as a compass. "Home," she said simply. "I found home." He reached across and took her hand. He held it the way he had been holding it since December of 1882, with the warmth and purpose of a man who knows what he holds and does not take it lightly. "So did I," he said. "I just didn't know I was looking for it until you arrived." The spring of 1888 brought changes and continuities in the particular mix that makes up a living life. The ranch was sound and productive. The cattle trade remained the economic heartbeat of Caldwell, and the community around them had the settled, working quality of a place that was not yet old enough to be complacent, but had moved past the most volatile uncertainties of its frontier years. The Indian Territory to the south remained a complex and often unjust situation, and the conversations at Caldwell's gathering places still sometimes turned to the question of what would happen as the territory's land situation continued to be pressured by outside interests, a question that Joseph and Kate both held with the honest discomfort it deserved. Kate's kitchen garden in the spring of 1888 was the most ambitious version of itself yet, extended along 2 new rows and including a section she had set aside for medicinal herbs, because she had been expanding her knowledge of basic remedies and found it both practically useful and genuinely interesting. Ruth Alderson had given her a book on the subject the previous Christmas, a thoughtful gift that had been thoroughly used. William started at the Caldwell School that fall, riding in with Samuel Brewster on the days Samuel went to town for supplies, an arrangement that was practical, and that William accepted with the dignity of a 5-year-old who considers himself more or less ready for most things. He came home with stories that were both informative about the schoolroom and revealing about the social dynamics of a room full of frontier children, and Kate and Joseph listened to these reports at supper with genuine interest and carefully maintained straight faces. Ellie remained at home and expressed strong opinions about this inequity. By the autumn of 1888, Kate knew she was expecting again. She told Joseph in the same quiet, direct way she had told him the first time, and his response was the same in its essential nature, the same deep joy, the same quality of a man absorbing something that is entirely good, though this time there was also the comfortable ease of someone who knows what comes next and is glad about it. "William will want a brother," Kate said. Ellie will want a sister, Joseph said. They will have to negotiate, Kate said. They will figure it out, Joseph said. They're both very determined. I wonder where they got that, Kate said, looking at him with an expression of innocent inquiry that made him laugh in the full, open way that she had been collecting instances of since November of 1882. The third child was born in May of 1889, a boy named Thomas for Kate's father. He arrived in the spring with the same energy the season brought to everything else, vigorous and present and entirely himself from the first. William received a brother with the absolute satisfaction of someone who had been quietly hoping for exactly this. And Ellie, after a brief period of assessment, decided that Thomas was acceptable and assigned herself his protector, a role she pursued with characteristic conviction. The house his father had built for a family was full in every sense of the word. In the summer of 1889, Joseph stood one evening on the porch and looked at the property around him, at the barns and the corral and the kitchen garden and the 3 fruit trees Kate had planted, and the apple tree by the fence that his father had planted, and he felt the fullness of it in a way that did not need to be communicated through words, though he tried anyway. "My father would have loved this," he said. "He would have loved her." He nodded toward the house, where Kate could be seen through the kitchen window moving with the efficient, easy grace she brought to all her work. "Tell me what he was like," Kate said from her chair on the porch. She was shelling peas, the children playing in the yard in the last of the evening light. Joseph sat down in the rocking chair, his mother's repaired rocking chair that was now 6 years into its new life, and had become the permanent fixture of the porch it had always deserved to be. He was a steady man, Joseph said. He didn't say much that he didn't mean, and he meant most of what he said. He could fix anything he put his mind to, and he put his mind to most things. He taught me that the way a man treats the people who depend on him is the truest measure of his character. Kate looked at the man across the porch from her, at this husband of 6 years, this father of 3 children, this rancher who was fair as a plumb line and twice as straight. "He taught you well," she said. Joseph looked at her. "I had good material to practice on," he said. The evening settled around them, warm and ordinary and full of everything that matters. William was chasing Ellie through the yard with a stick he had decided was a sword, and Ellie was running and shrieking with the full vocal commitment she brought to everything, and Thomas was sitting solidly in the dust near Kate's chair and regarding a beetle with a scientist's concentration. The prairie stretched out in every direction, wide and amber in the last light, and the creek ran audible in the summer stillness, and the apple tree by the fence was heavy with fruit that would be apple butter and apple preserves and apple pie through the winter months ahead. Kate set her bowl of peas on the porch railing and reached across and took Joseph's hand, and he held hers in his, warm and certain, the way he had always held it. She thought about a Tuesday morning in April 7 years ago, about a woman who had stepped off a stagecoach with everything she owned in a single carpetbag, and a piece of paper with a man's name on it, who had walked up to a fence line and waited for a rancher to notice her, who had told the truth when asked a direct question and been believed, because the truth has a quality that honest eyes carry without effort. She thought about a man who had looked at her across a corral fence and seen something clear and real and chosen to trust it. She thought about all the particular and ordinary and extraordinary things that had happened in the space between that morning and this evening, and she held all of it with a fullness of gratitude that did not require any particular expression beyond the simple fact of being where she was, with whom she was, in the life they had built together from an honest beginning. "What are you thinking?" Joseph asked, the way he sometimes asked when he saw something in her expression that he wanted to know about. She looked at him. She looked at him the way you look at something you have looked at so many times it has become part of how you see the world, something you cannot imagine the world without, something that has become as essential as the quality of light. "I am thinking," she said, "that this is exactly where I was supposed to be." He looked back at her with those steady dark eyes that had never pretended to be anything other than what they were. "Yes," he said, "it is. The children played in the fading light. The creek ran. The apple tree held its fruit. The prairie was vast and beautiful and entirely itself. And on the porch of the house that William Hudson had built carefully for his family, his son and his son's wife sat together in the evening of a long and well-lived day, holding hands in the particular quiet of people who have found their home in each other and know it, and intend to keep it well. The years ahead would bring their ordinary difficulties and their extraordinary gifts, the hard seasons and the good ones, the losses that life requires and the abundances it offers in return. Thomas would grow into a boy of his grandfather's steadiness and his mother's perceptiveness. Ellie would grow into a woman of such considerable character that the world would have to expand slightly to accommodate her. William would grow up with the land in his blood and the stars in his eyes, and the values of a man who was shown, every day of his childhood, what it looks like to treat people fairly and love them honestly. And Kate Winslow, who had once arrived in a Kansas cattle town with nothing but a carpetbag and an honest face and a willingness to be exactly who she was, would look back on the morning she had stepped off that stagecoach and understand it as the beginning of the best story of her life. The story that had started at a fence line. The story that had started with a pair of green eyes and a direct question and an honest answer. The story that had started, as the best ones often do, with someone choosing to trust what they could see.